Welcome back to another conversation with Carl. Today I'm excited to talk to Catherine Hayhoe. She's a climate scientist and who's also a Christian. Currently, she's the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy and a professor at Texas Tech University. And if that does not keep her busy enough, she's also the author of Saving Us, a climate scientist's case for hope and healing in a divided world. Welcome, Catherine, to the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to get started by asking is what is the state of climate change today?
Well, first of all, it's real and it really is human caused. In fact, people are often surprised to learn that all of the observed warming plus some is human caused. And then people are like, well, what about natural factors? Aren't they in play? They are, but according to natural factors right now, the Earth should be cooling very, very gradually and slowly. And instead, it's warming faster and faster. Even worse, the impacts are coming home to roost. 20 years ago, most people would be hard pressed to point to a way that climate change was directly impacting their lives, unless maybe they lived in Alaska, for example. But these days, everyone can point to the way that extreme events like heat waves and floods are getting worse. Our home insurance is skyrocketing. The price of basic groceries is going up because of how climate change is affecting everything from, matcha tea, not exactly a basic grocery, but it's being affected, and the price of bananas. And even the air we breathe is becoming choked with wildfire smoke, or it's just getting so hot in the summer that we have to change when our kids are actually spending time outdoors. Climate change is not only real and serious, it's actually here and it's directly impacting our lives today.
So, what do we need to do to fix the problem?
Well, that is exactly what I want to know too. And so I have been looking into that. When it comes to solutions, it turns out that we have most of the solutions we already need. And to explain the solutions we need, I like to use the image of a swimming pool. An above ground swimming pool like the one I grew up with in my backyard in Toronto, where my toes could just touch the ground when I was learning how to swim. So if you think of the swimming pool as the atmosphere, and the level of water in the swimming pool is the level of heat trapping gases in the atmosphere. Before the Industrial Revolution, we had just the right amount of water in our swimming pool so our toes could just touch the ground. And you want some water in the swimming pool. If we didn't have heat trapping gases in our atmosphere, our planet would be a frozen ball of ice. But then about 200 years ago, we stuck a hose in the swimming pool, and we've been turning the hose up every year. So every year, the level of water in the swimming pool is rising faster and faster. So what's the number one thing we need to do? We need to turn off the hose. And there's so many ways to do that. Through efficiency, we waste about 2/3 of the energy we produce. Through clean energy, through stopping deforestation, through growing our food in much better ways that are better for us and better for the planet. There's so many great ways to turn off the hose. And in fact, many of those would make us money too. Oxford estimated last year that switching from fossil fuels to a clean energy economy would save us at least $12 trillion by 2050. And the faster we did it, the more money we'd save. But there's two more things we can do. Our pool also has a drain, and the drain is nature. We have too much carbon in the atmosphere in the pool. We want more carbon back in our soils and our ecosystem. And by making the drain bigger, we can help. And so at the Nature Conservancy, we do a lot of what we call nature-based solutions, where we are protecting and restoring not just forests, but also grasslands, wetlands, all kinds of different ecosystems, including climate-smart agriculture, to take more carbon out of the atmosphere where we have too much and put it back into the soil and ecosystems where we want it. But there's one more thing we have to do, and that is we have to learn how to swim. The level of water in the pool is so high that for many people, their toes don't touch the ground. That's climate adaptation and resilience. So turning off the hose, making the drain bigger, and learning how to swim, those are the three ways that we can do what we need to tackle this problem.
So, if I'm sitting in my apartment in New York City, I compost, but
Mhm.
just say my neighbor does not. Is it really making a difference?
Well, this is exactly the question, because for me, when I first stepped on the carbon scale, so to speak, I measured my carbon footprint. I found out that the biggest source of my carbon footprint was flying, actually. And it wasn't flying to yoga retreats in Bali. I've never been to one of those. It was flying to scientific meetings to talk about climate change. So I decided I guess probably 15 years ago now, that I was going to convert most of my talks to virtual talks. And whenever I travel in person, I don't travel for single events. I travel for as many events as possible. So, for example, I was at Climate Week recently, and I think I did 48 events and meetings in 6 days. So, the amount of carbon per event was quite low compared to flying to Climate Week. But then the pandemic happened. And during the pandemic, I read a news story that said that airlines were flying thousands of empty flights just to keep their gate assignments. And I thought to myself, all of this work I do to minimize my travel emissions is not even a drop in the bucket compared to all the other stuff that's going on so wastefully. So I thought to myself, there has to be a better way for an individual to have an impact. Of course, I do want to live true to my values, but if I really want to have an impact, there has to be something different. So I started to look into the science of how people think, how we make decisions, how social change happens. And that was what led to me writing my book, Saving Us, because I realized through looking at the science and the data that the most important thing each of us individually can do when it comes to taking climate action has nothing to do with our personal carbon footprint. And that is a revolutionary thought.
Yeah, well, that is because I'm thinking to myself, what that?
So the most important thing each of us can do is to do what you and I are actually doing right now, which is to have a conversation about why it matters and what we can do about it. Not so much, I think of this not so much as the head, not so much about like the ice sheets and the polar bears and the ocean circulation, but about the heart, the air our kids are breathing, the price that we're paying for our insurance, and the hands, what real solutions look like. Because the data shows that in most countries around the world, including the US, most people don't even talk about it even once in a while. And if we don't talk about it, why would we care? And if we don't care, why would we ever do anything about it? So if you look at the top 6 ways that people can make a difference, number 1 is to have a conversation about the heart and the hands. And so that's why every week I have a newsletter called Talking Climate, where I share good news, not so good news, and something people can do to start conversations. The second thing we can do is to join a climate action group. And so on my website, I actually have a list of all these different climate action groups for someone, if you're a parent, if you're a sports fan, if you're a person of faith, if you live in a certain place, if you're a young person, if you're a senior citizen. Join together with others to help amplify your voice. We can also, number 3, we can also use our money in terms of not just what we buy or what we don't buy, but also where we put it, investing in climate-friendly banks and retirement funds. We can use our voice to speak to our elected officials, not just at the federal level, but at the city level, the county level, the state, or the provincial level to advocate for change. And then we can also use our voice where we work or where we study, and we can make personal choices, which we all should do in our lives, but then we can make those contagious by talking about them. So like you said, you compost, but don't just compost. Talk to your neighbor about how amazing my aunt has this amazing little composter that she puts on her counter, that she puts all her food scraps into, and then she pushes the button overnight and she loves it and she tells everybody about it. So tell people about what you're doing to make that change contagious.
No, I realized once I started composting how much less my trash is because I already recycle and now I'm composting. So now my trash is now not as full. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of some of the benefits you can talk about. So, I mean, I subscribe to a wind-only power plan, and it's quite affordable. I love buying secondhand clothes online. They're much more affordable. And of course, you don't have to put all the water and resources and emissions into creating them. So we can talk about solutions, but we can make them contagious by sharing our joy that we get out of them.
So while I was doing research, there's a lot of hate that comes. Yes, I know. And I find why is this so emotional? Why are people,
Mm.
you had a great quote that I thought, you say people do not disagree with the science. However, they disagree with values, ideologies, worldviews, and it seems emotional.
It
So,
is emotional. So now you might say, what do I mean people don't agree with or don't disagree with the science? Because if you look at the attacks I get every day on social media, they're typically people saying, oh, climate isn't changing, or it's just natural factors, or CO2 is plant food, or warmer is better. And so you'll think, well, aren't they rejecting the science? But the science that explains how digging up and burning coal and gas and oil produces heat-trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, causing it to warm. It's the same science that explains how stoves heat food and how airplanes fly. And there's not a lot of people online claiming that stoves don't heat food or that airplanes don't fly. I won't say there's nobody because there's somebody for everything, but the point is they're not actually rejecting the science. They're rejecting the conclusions, which are that we need to do something about climate change. Because people believe that the solutions to climate change pose a greater threat to their well-being or their identity or their ideology than the actual risks. And so, but they say, well, if it's real and I don't think we need to fix it, that would actually probably make me a bad person. So we engage in what's called motivated reasoning, which is mostly subconscious, not conscious, to say, well, if I'm a good person and I don't want to fix it, that means that it can't be real or it can't be that bad. And so they offer excuses that are sort of like the whack-a-mole game at the fair. If you hit down one excuse, another one just pops right up because the real issue is they don't want to fix it. So what's the real solution? The real solution is not arguing that, yes, it is real or it is human caused or no, it's not volcanoes and yes, we can have too much CO2. That's not the solution. The solution is to address the root issue, which is they don't think there's positive practical solutions that would benefit them. And so when we talk about the solutions that actually save us money or make us more independent or clean up our air or make our kids healthier, then there are solutions that people can get on board with. And when people are on board with solutions, often their objections to the science disappear.
How would you describe yourself?
I am a Christian. And in fact, the reason I'm a climate scientist is because I'm a Christian. So I was planning to become an astrophysicist. And in fact, my first degree and my first few papers are in that field. But I took a class on climate change to sort of round out my breadth requirements before I headed to graduate school. And that was when I learned that climate change is not only an environmental issue, which it is, but it's also a profoundly human issue. It is taking these critical issues like poverty and hunger, disease, lack of access to clean water or basic health care, or even education and gender equity, and it's making them worse. And the people who've done the least to contribute to the problem are those who are bearing the brunt of the impacts, which is absolutely unfair. So for me as a Christian, somebody who believes that we are to care for all living things on this planet, which include our sisters and our brothers, as well as plants and animals and everything else, I felt that if I don't do what I can to help fix this problem, I won't be actually living out my faith. So I became a climate scientist because I was a Christian. And then I discovered, and I would like to point out here I'm Canadian, I discovered, much to my surprise, moving to the US, that many people who shared my faith did not share my perspective on this. And this was quite a while ago. Now it's obvious to everyone around the world that this is the case. And so being in the US as an evangelical Christian, I was really surprised to find out that many people who would also call themselves evangelical Christians would say that climate change isn't real. And in fact, if you look at people by their faith demographics, white evangelical Christians and white Catholics are together at the bottom of the scale of the people who are least likely to agree that climate is changing, humans are responsible, the impacts are serious, and we should do something about it. But digging into it even further, it turns out that about 40% of people who call themselves evangelical in the States don't even go to church. So where are they learning from? They're not learning from their theology, they're learning from their ideology. So today in the US, that label has become more of a political label than a theological label, and to the point where I asked the former president of the National Association of Evangelicals in the US, I said, could you just define what evangelical is for me? Because I was wondering, should I even be calling myself that? And he said, to me, evangelical is someone who takes the Bible seriously. And so I thought, well, that is what I feel like I'm doing being a climate scientist. So that is why I continue to call myself that, even though for many people, it means something very different today.
So I have a lot of questions on that.
I bet.
Does does science and religion, do they butt heads or do they work
So the fact that science and religion appear to be in conflict is one that goes back many decades in U.S. history. But if there's a really great book called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, written by a Notre Dame historian. And it is fascinating because it starts at the dawn of the American Revolution. It goes all the way through to today, and it traces the origins of perceived conflicts between science and faith. And what Mark Knoll shows in that book is that in each case, political ideology has been at the root of that perceived conflict, whether we're talking about human origins, whether we're talking about the age of the earth, or if we're talking about climate change today. On my part, I feel that if we believe that God created this incredible universe that we live in, and if we also believe that the Bible is God's inspired word, then how could the two possibly be in conflict with each other? And if they appear to be in conflict, is that not because of our own limited human understanding, which is always developing and always growing? I mean, compare what we know and what we think today to compare to what we knew and what we thought 200 years ago. Is it not due to our limited understanding? How could there be a fundamental difference between these two things if we believe they came from the same source? So to me, it's really like they're two sides of the same coin. And one of my favorite verses in the Bible talks about how God has not given us a spirit of fear, but rather a spirit of love, power, and a sound mind. And to me, what is a sound mind for other than to figure out how the world around us makes, or how the world around us works, and how science can inform the decisions we make?
There's a great joke that I always find fun that I find fascinating. There's a hurricane coming. This man is told he has to leave his home. He says, "No, I'm going to be okay. God's going to protect me." Then the hurricane comes. They come to his house and they say, "You have to leave. The water's rising." He says, "No, God's going to protect me." Then he gets up to his second floor and he's waiting. A guy comes along with a boat to come to rescue him. And the guy said, "No, God's going to protect me." And he gets to the top of his roof. The water's coming up there. There's the helicopter comes to rescue him. He says, "No, no, no, God's going to protect me." And then he dies and he goes and talks to God. And God says to him, he says to God, "Why didn't you protect me?" And God says, "I did. I told you there's a hurricane coming. I sent you a boat. I sent you people. I sent you a helicopter." And I think that is what science is, right? It's the tools. If you believe that God created us, he let us be. So now we have our free will to do what we're going to do. And now it's up to us to take what we have on this planet to figure out how to work with it.
That's one of my favorite jokes. I think that that very accurately sums up exactly the situation that we're in.
I sit there and I struggle with trying to figure out why this is so complicated because to me, when you are looking at 100-year storm in this area or 100-year storm in that area, and you're seeing them more rapidly and more frequently, you would think to yourself, okay, this is happening. So I'm trying to figure out why we are struggling to get to where we need to be so that we can solve the problem.
Well, for evangelicals in the United States, it's because over the last 50 or 60 years, concerted and very successful efforts were made to associate evangelicalism with conservative ideology. So it didn't begin with climate change, it began with the desegregation of schools. And then it began with the introduction of the abortion issue. And decade by decade, there's another really good book called The Evangelicals that also lays this out in more recent terms. Decade after decade, there have been deliberate efforts to basically replace theology with ideology in support of conservative politics in the US. So that's how the evangelicals got mixed up in this, because if you read the Bible, and in fact, I have a little series on YouTube called Global Weirding, that one of my most popular episodes is, what does the Bible say about climate change? If you read the Bible, it's full of caring for instructions to care for nature, to care for the poor. I mean, in Revelation, it even says God will judge those who destroy the earth. If you take the Bible seriously, I think you'd be at the front of the line demanding climate action. And I should add that these core values are core values of almost every other major religion as well. They're not unique to Christianity. So if you really, really took the Bible seriously, you'd be there. But due to this conflation between politics and ideology, a lot of evangelicals in the US are ending up on the side of the fence where they have to actually reject not only what science is saying, but what their own Bible says too. So looking at it, though, from the perspective of climate change, how did climate change get politicized? Because A thermometer does not give you a different answer depending on how you vote. And as you said, if a hurricane's coming, it doesn't politely knock on your door and say, "Excuse me, who did you vote for in the last federal election?" before it rips the roof off your house, right? So going back to the 1980s, the very first polling in the late 80s and early 90s showed that in the US, Democrats and Republicans felt the same way about climate change, or global warming as they called it back then. And that's because even though scientists had known about this for years and had been warning about this for decades, the impacts hadn't hit home yet. So it was still a comfortably future issue that we didn't have to do anything about. But in 1988, we had a really hot year and a hot summer. James Hansen and Michael Oppenheimer testified to Congress about how, yes, climate change was real. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released their first report in 1990. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which eventually led to the Paris Agreement, was signed in 1992. And so in that little window of time, late 80s, early 90s, climate change moved from a comfortably future issue. Even though U.S. scientists first warned Lyndon B. Johnson of it in 1965, it moved from a future issue that we don't have to do anything about to a present issue that we do. And if you look at the richest corporations in the world at that time, just about every single one of them was a company who either dug up, processed, sold, or made things that burned fossil fuels. And we know that the biggest contributor to climate change is burning fossil fuels. So the denial machine swung into action. They literally hired some of the same spin doctors that had been used by the tobacco industry to deny the connection between lung cancer and smoking, and they poured money into deliberately muddying the waters on, is climate change happening? Is it real? Is it serious? Do we have to do something about it? There's this really good book and documentary now too called Merchants of Doubt that actually explains this in detail. And the result was wildly successful beyond anything they could have dreamed of. It's gotten to the point now where climate denial is worse now than any time in the past, even though the impacts and the science are much more obvious now than they've ever been. It was a concerted effort to do what? To reject the need for action as long as possible, so all of those industries and all of the politicians they support could continue to benefit as long as possible.
Do you think after Al Gore loses the election in 2000, he does the inconvenient truth? Do you think that was a contributor to politicizing this? Or do you think
Unfortunately,
do we need leaders to speak for us to help us get to where we need to go?
well, I think the answer is yes to both of those. So Al Gore is a staunch and tireless advocate for climate action and climate solutions. He is very clear on the causes and the solutions, and even till today, he continues to launch new initiatives like the Climate Trace Initiative that uses satellite data to actually track where these emissions are coming from. We can see them in real time now thanks to satellite data. At the same time, though, having someone who is clearly affiliated with one side of the political spectrum versus the other become one of the primary spokespeople for this issue obviously did politicize it, because I've even had people say to me, one time I was speaking at a farmers conference in West Texas a number of years ago, and I was explaining how, according to natural cycles, we should be getting cooler right now, but we're actually getting warmer and warmer, and that's causing increased evaporation, increased crop stress, stronger and more sustained droughts. All the farmers were nodding along with me. And then afterwards, one man came up to me and he said, everything you said makes sense, and I would have liked to agree with you. But if I agree with you, that means I have to agree with Al Gore, and I could never do that. So people even recognize that the politicization of this is preventing them from agreeing with the facts.
So, how do you change his mind?
Well, the most effective way to change people's minds, and I should say, this is not for the 10% dismissive. This is for everyone else. 10% of Americans, and smaller numbers, but still existing in Canada, the UK, Australia, other places, are dismissive. And I define a dismissive myself as somebody who, if an angel from God with brand new tablets of stone saying global warming is real in foot-high letters of flame appeared before them, they wouldn't change their minds. So if they wouldn't change their minds for that, why would I think I can do it? I don't think I can. There are people who are so convinced that climate solutions pose an existential threat to them that they will go to their grave saying it's not real, it's just a hoax. But for everybody else, the 90%, some of whom are doubtful, some of whom are disengaged, some of whom are cautious, we absolutely can engage. But remember, what's the biggest issue for them? Is it really the science? No, it's the fact that they don't think they can get on board with the solutions. So if there is a solution that they can get on board with that helps them become an even better, more authentic, more genuine version of who they already are and who they want to be, that's what changes their mind. So let me give you one example that I talk about in my book. John's dad. So John is one of my colleagues who, a long time ago, back when he was studying solar physics, so he comes from an astronomy background like I do, he would go home, every once in a while to have dinner with his dad. And his dad, a staunch conservative, would be like, "Oh, John, there's more polar bears now than there've ever been. So much for that whole global warming thing." John got so irritated by this that he launched a website called Skeptical Science. And it is the premier debunking of sciencey sounding myths on climate change in the world. They have long, short, and medium answers to over 200 sciencey sounding objections to climate change with all the peer-reviewed literature. John, furthermore, went back to school and ended up getting a PhD in cognitive psychology and became one of the leading experts in the world on sciencey sounding myths, rejecting climate change, vaccines, COVID, and other things like that. Do you think any of that changed his father's mind?
I don't think so.
It did not.
It did not. I don't think it did.
But
Yes.
in the rural area of Australia where his dad lived, it turned out the government was offering a rebate on solar panels a number of years ago. And so John knew that his dad liked to save money and his dad liked to be independent. And it didn't hurt to stick it to the government either. So he told his dad about this rebate, and his dad got solar panels, not to help with climate change, but because he could save money, he could become more independent, and he could stick it to the foolish government who was willing to offer this rebate. And so pretty soon, every month, John was getting these updates on how much money his dad saved on the solar panels. And then about 2 years after his dad got the solar panels, John was having dinner with him again. And in the course of conversation, his dad said, "Global warming, it's such a serious issue, and I've always thought so. Now, have I told you how much money I've saved on my solar panels?" And John said he almost fell off his chair because not only had his dad changed his mind on climate change, he had actually forgotten that he ever rejected it because being part of the solution was so much part of his personality today. So the solutions to climate change no longer threatened him. Rather, they actually made him an even thriftier, even more independent, even shrewder version of who he already was. And that was what changed his dad's mind. Isn't that amazing?
No, that is really good because that's what's happening, how we started composting, because we live in New York City. It's now required to compost. And I would have sworn against it. I did not want to do it. I didn't go along willingly because I thought, where am I going to have to take this to and how it's going to be a big pain. But now we've done it for over 8, 9 months now. And I am a big believer in composting. But it was the government that got me there, or the city that got me there, right? So it made, to me, thinking about where am I going to get the change and how am I going to make it? And our building that we live in also has composting bins downstairs. So everything worked in favor for me to do that. But I would not, sitting here and talking to you, I would not think, let me go compost, because I had to get there. And now that I got there, I'm a big believer in it because I'll say our trash is less. I think we're making a difference. And I am a big believer in this. And I tell people all the time, oh, you should compost. Going back to your original point, we have to have conversations.
Exactly. And so similarly, like you might not want to use plastic bags. Like I've used reusable bags for a long time. But when we use our voices to encourage a ban on plastic bags in our city or our region, then imagine all the other people who weren't using reusable bags before, but now they have to, or they have to pay for bags. And then they're like, actually, this is great because these bags hold more and they don't break and I don't have these massive things of plastic bags around. It's this sort of positive feedback cycle that we can initiate when we take action, but we encourage others to take action too. And when we use our voice with whatever city or region we live in to advocate for further change, the more we do this, the more happens.
I mean, that's the only way forward. Where do you think we're going from here? How do you see climate change playing out in the next few years? How worried should we be? And how much more do we need to do?
Well, first of all, on the positive side, it is very clear that the clean energy revolution is unstoppable. So the cost of new solar versus natural gas, the advances in storage of energy for when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow, the advances in heat pump technology and electric vehicles. I mean, at this point, trying to invest in coal when we already have all these other sources of energy, it's like trying to invest in horses and buggies when Henry Ford has already built his first assembly line and he's turning out Model T Fords. So that's where we are in terms of the technology. Now, if we were back in the late 80s or early 90s, when that first denial first started, if we were back there in terms of our carbon emissions and global temperature change, but we were where we are today in terms of technology, I would be pretty excited. I'd be like, you know what? We're just starting to see the first impacts of climate change, which we did in the late 80s, but the solutions are on their way. Now, unfortunately, we're not. We're in the year 2025. And so we're already almost at the 1.5 degree C point in global temperature. We are already seeing massive changes in what I call global weirding. Hurricanes are stronger, heat waves are more frequent, heavy downpours are more intense. We're already seeing the signal in everything from the groceries to the insurance to the supply chain impacts from extreme weather, sea level rise, and more. And we're seeing the impact on the natural world too, that we depend on literally for the air we breathe and the water we drink and the food we eat. So, from the perspective of where the solutions are, we're heading in the right direction. But from the perspective of where the impacts are, we're heading in the wrong direction. What we need is to speed up the change a lot. How do we speed up that change? The number one thing each of us can do is by having conversations wherever we work. Hey, this other organization is doing this. Why don't we try it too? Wherever we study, wherever we worship, wherever we live. Having those conversations about how we together could be doing more faster is the biggest way that individuals can help catalyze and accelerate change.
Another question that I did have that I just thought of.
Sure.
What do you say to the person that says this is just cyclical?
So I have this little YouTube series I refer to called Global Weirding. And I have about 35 short videos there that answer all the most common sciencey questions I get about climate change. So questions like, well, it's just a few degrees of warming. Why is that bad? Questions like, what does the Bible say about climate change? And one of the videos is about, well, it's just a natural cycle. So why does this matter? So in that, I unpack how natural cycles are still occurring today. But according to natural cycles right now, we should be getting slowly cooler. And instead, we're getting warmer faster and faster. So natural factors are helping us out right now. We would be even warmer if it wasn't for them.
Anything else you want to tell us before we wrap up?
Yeah. What the science often does is it basically paints a vision of an apocalyptic future that we have to avoid. It's not about saving the planet. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. It really is about saving us. And so that's why when I wrote a book, I called it Saving Us. We humans have built our entire society and economy based on the assumption of a stable climate. Literally from where and how we grow our food, to where our biggest cities are located, to where we get our water and how it's allocated. It's all designed for conditions that don't exist anymore. When it comes to who's most at risk from climate change after the polar bears, it's us. So it's not about somehow, the planet versus people or the environment versus the economy. It's all of us together or none of us at all. But although it's so easy to paint that vision of an apocalyptic future where there isn't enough water to go around and where 2/3 of the world's biggest cities are underwater and where people are fighting over food, that's not what inspires us as humans to move forward. Science says that our brains are literally wired to move forward towards something that is better than what we have today, not worse. And so at the same time that we need to clearly communicate the risks, and believe me, there are many risks, it is even more important to paint a picture of what a future that is better could look like. And the good news is that climate solutions are solutions for a better future. Because what do? They clean up the air we breathe. Pollution from fossil fuels kills millions of people every year. So climate solutions for clean energy, they give us air that's cleaner than what we have today. They address issues like our health. They give us ecosystems and food systems that are healthier and more sustainable than what we have today. Cities that are greener and more walkable. They address inequalities in socioeconomic systems and race and gender. They give us that better future, a future that we want to live in, where we go outside and the sky is blue. The area around us is green. The water is drinkable. Our communities are walkable. Our children are healthy. They give us that better future. We are not painting a sufficiently compelling vision of a better future to move towards, and the way to get there is through solutions for climate and for nature.
That's so great. Catherine Hayhoe, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for listening. If you like, just remember to hit the subscribe button. Thank you so much, and see you next time for
Thank you.
another conversation.